Hello, everybody. As you're coming in, welcome. We'll get started in a minute. In about 1 minute, we'll get started.
Good evening. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice of the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however infinitesimal, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. Welcome everyone to the second event of the USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice for the fall 2020 semester, where tonight Rebecca Pierce will discuss anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism in the context of US white supremacy from her perspective as a Black Jewish filmmaker and activist. My name is Camille Shira Angel, and I'm the University Rabbi in Residence and an adjunct faculty member in the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. I want to begin thanking the SWIG JSSJ faculty and staff, as well as the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and Critical Diversity Studies here at USF for co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to take a brief moment and tell you about our SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Founded in 1977, our program is the first Jewish Studies chair or program at a Catholic university anywhere in the world. In 2008, we were reestablished as the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, the first academic program worldwide to formally link Jewish studies with social justice. Including a minor in this field, in the classroom, the program offers a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses not found in other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer extraordinary events that are free and open to the public, such as tonight's event. Let me quickly tell you about two other events we're having this semester, both of which deal with varying responses to racial injustice. On October 8th at 6:30, White and Jewish on the Way to Racial Justice. Rabbi Amy Eilberg will present sacred texts from the Jewish tradition that inspired deep engagement with issues of racial justice and personal transformation. And on October 21st at 6:30, Racism, Anti-Semitism, and Israel-Palestine. Dr. Clarence Jones will address this important topic in the 6th annual JSSJ Human Rights Lecture. We hope you'll be able to join us for these events. Through the SWIG JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or another social identity altogether. Now I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Oren Kroll-Zeldin, the interim director of JSSJ, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, Camille, and thank you all for participating and attending tonight's webinar. We're very happy to have you join us for this conversation. Before I introduce Rebecca, let me tell you a little bit about how this will work. Rebecca will speak for a little while. As you think of questions, if you think of questions, you'll see a little Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. You do not need to wait until the end of Rebecca's presentation to type in your questions. At any time you have a question, put it in there. When Rebecca's finished, I will look through the questions and I'll field any questions that come through the Q&A, and I will pose them to Rebecca, and we can have a conversation towards the end of the evening. With that, let me introduce Rebecca and say, first of all, that I have been from afar following and admiring Rebecca's work for quite a few years. Anytime I'm wondering sort of how to think about certain issues regarding Black-Jewish relations or anti-Semitism or racism in the United States, Rebecca is one of the first places I always go. Has Rebecca written something, published something, go to her social media platforms, scroll through what she has to say on Twitter, because her analysis is so sharp, and it really helps me to think about these issues in a much deeper way. So I hope that you will find similar inspiration by Rebecca tonight. And let me tell you a little bit about Rebecca. Rebecca Pierce is a Black Jewish journalist and documentary filmmaker based in San Francisco. Her multimedia storytelling covers a diverse range of topics, including race, religion, global conflict, and human rights. She has a BA in film and digital media from UC Santa Cruz and was an affiliate fellow at Harvard Divinity School's Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. She's currently a participant in the Wallace Annenberg Helix Fellowship, which leads artists in experiential studies of Jewish communities and multicultural societies in pre-World War II Europe. Rebecca's writing, her editorial writing and public speaking on racial justice issues affecting African American and Jewish communities has been featured by The Nation, The New Republic, Jewish Currents, and NPR's All Things Considered. I know that she also has a new podcast that should be dropping soon or has dropped already. Maybe we can ask her a little bit more about that. And a veteran activist with tremendous experience on the topic that she'll be addressing tonight. We are very pleased that Rebecca is joining us. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca Pierce to USF. Rebecca.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me. It really does mean a lot to get to present, especially at USF. Being born in San Francisco and living here, it's really important for me to speak to my community, and I know a lot of other people will be joining us, and I'm excited to speak to y'all too. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll be sharing with y'all. I know it's not the most exciting thing, but it's the easiest way to convey everything I'm saying because there'll be a lot of complex ideas. I'm gonna start sharing now. So this presentation is called Other Together, and it's really an exploration of Black and Jewish solidarity and how we can fight anti-Semitism and racism together, and the sort of complications to that history. I just want to start by defining a few terms so we're all on the same page. When I use the term Jewish, hopefully that's something that people are already familiar with, but just so we're clear, I'm referring to people and communities who are identifying with Judaism as a religion and or a culture. And we know that there are secular Jews, so I just want to be clear that I'm referring to those communities as well. Ashkenazi is a term used to refer to Jews who have their roots in Central and Eastern Europe. I happen to be a Black Ashkenazi Jew. through mixing, but that's my personal background. Sephardi refers to Jews with roots in Spain. Jews of color is a term that was actually created as a self-identifying organizing term for Jewish people who hold Black, Indigenous, or POC identities. It's a limited terminology, but it does come from our movement, so that's important to know. White supremacy. When I talk about white supremacy in this talk, I'm not just talking about beliefs, I'm talking about systematic issues. So when I say white supremacy, I mean a system that's based on the belief that white people are a superior race and should therefore dominate society. Finally, when I say anti-Semitism, I'm referring to anti-Jewish prejudice and oppression. We in the Jewish community have a lot of debates and arguments over the ultimate meaning of this word, but that's what I'm using in this particular talk. And I want to be really clear that Jewish people did not invent this word for ourselves. It has roots in other people trying to define our communities, and so that's important to remember. Before I really get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to say whiteness. When I talk about whiteness, it's not just about how people feel or personally identify, it's about a construct that is often applied by outside forces. It's best understood as a structure that you can either be included in or excluded from. And when I talk about the shifting Jewish relationship to whiteness, that is actually not unique. Ashkenazi Jews, along with Irish, Italian, and other communities, all faced a shift from being considered not white to being considered white in America. And the price of entry into whiteness was assimilation, which meant giving up the things that made you different in a lot of cases. Finally, Jewish people can be any ethnicity or race. 10 to 20% of the US Jewish community identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And also the mainstream way that we talk about Jews is often white-centered and often Ashkenazi normative, which means a lot of times we assume that all Jews are Ashkenazi. Throughout this talk, you might hear me actually falling into this, and that's in part because of the limits of language in discussing these things. And please know I'm aware of it and working on ways to improve that. All right, so I want to start off our talk by talking about this concept of Black-Jewish relations, which I think was mentioned earlier. This is a framework for talking about the relationships between Black and Jewish communities. A lot of times it's based on these assumptions that I just mentioned, that Jewish people are assumed to be white and Ashkenazi. Black people are assumed to be not Jewish. So someone like me would obviously problematize a really easy conceptualization of Black-Jewish relations. And then there are two different approaches to discussing this that we find usually break down along right or left lines in the Jewish community. Some people assume that Black and Jewish people are natural allies with a shared interest. Usually that interest is fighting white supremacy. Other people tend to assume that Black and Jewish interests are separate and inherently opposed to each other. And this is something we hear a lot in the right wing of the Jewish community. And also you can hear this in the Black community among some Black separatists and other groups. So one of the things that unites this sort of idea, the positive idea of Black-Jewish relations, is a shared experience that Black and Jewish communities have under white supremacy. Black and Jewish people have experienced housing discrimination, discrimination from workplaces, discrimination and exclusion from what is normally referred to as the white space. And this is, white-dominated spaces where people who don't fit into that are assumed to be other. Black and Jewish communities also have faced violence in our community spaces. Churches and synagogues have both been bombed by white supremacists, both historically and then attacked more recently, as we know. Race science and eugenics also tend to target both Black and Jewish people as inferior. This has influenced everything from California policy to national policy to, unfortunately, the Nazi race laws. And on the other side of this coin, Black and Jewish people are often described as being sort of in a conspiracy together or in cahoots to undermine the white race. If you look at the image on this slide, this is an anti-miscegenation poster from the 1960s that is sort of blaming Jewish people for white girls ending up with Black men. We also have a history of being accused of being communists. Some of us were communists, but also this was used as a slur, and our organizing was targeted during the Red Scare. We also have similar languages and cultures of resistance. For Black folks, the Passover story is something that we reference a lot in our freedom movements, and Jewish people have a lot of relationship and relating to Black stories of moving from slavery to freedom. So this is sort of some of the positive, it's a negative experience that brought us together in a positive way. But to really understand the relationships between Black and Jewish communities and their organizing, you have to also understand the ways that Jewish relationships to white supremacy have changed over time. So historically, Jewish people were excluded from US notions of whiteness, and this actually began before the United States was a country. Colonization as we know it, including the colonization that happened in California, the land we're on right now, much of it was carried out by Spain or began by Spain. And the Spanish Inquisition, which was the targeting of Jewish and Muslim residents of Andalusia, helped both fund and influence colonization of the Americas. Jewish people's belongings that were seized were actually in some cases used to fund Columbus's voyage, which we don't really talk about. And the Spanish Inquisition continued on the American continent, and Jewish people were killed and tortured for being Jewish, even if they had converted or were trying to hide their Jewish identity. Once we get to the US history, there's a lot of varying history, but when we really start to talk about Jewish exclusion in America, we usually tend to begin at the turn of the century with Ashkenazi Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. US immigration law targeted these communities and also kept people from fleeing here during the Holocaust. And we know this tragically resulted in the death of a lot of people, including Anne Frank is one example. Housing discrimination under racially restrictive housing covenants is another key way that Jewish people experienced exclusion from whiteness. And even the ordinances that we refer to as sundown town ordinances that made it so that Black, Latino, Asian, and sometimes Jewish people were excluded from towns also targeted Jewish people and were part of institutionalizing anti-Semitism. This changed over time, but it's part of our history and it's important to acknowledge. Jews could also be banned from whites-only country clubs, universities. My grandfather was actually the first Jewish person in his house at Harvard because they missed that he was Jewish because he had a Christian sounding last name. Some workplaces and businesses would also refuse to cater to or hire Jews. Finally, Jews were frequent targets of the KKK, eugenicists, as we discussed a little bit earlier, and also white nationalism, which I will dive into in a little bit. There's another side of this history though, and it's a complicated one because throughout time, these things have shifted and changed. So there are ways that Jewish people have been included in US whiteness at a much earlier date than we often discuss. So early Jewish communities in the US, while they were targeted during colonization, were also participants in it. It's important to recognize this. In the US, Sephardic and German Jews in the antebellum South were able to own property, which was the sign of being legally white at a time when Black people were property. And for reference, the biggest Jewish community in the US prior to the Civil War was in Charleston, South Carolina, and Jewish people there we know owned slaves at almost a similar rate to their white Christian neighbors. Now it's important to distinguish this from claims that Jewish people orchestrated the slave trade, which are not true, but we know that Jewish people were able to act as white people in fundamental ways during this period, and one of those ways was owning Black people as property. And some of those Black people ended up being Jewish, but that's unfortunately a history that we don't have time to address today. Some Jews also participated in the Confederacy. Judah P. Benjamin was a Sephardic Jewish lawyer who was both, I think, the Secretary of War and Secretary of State of the Confederacy at various times. Later on, we get to the Jewish history that we're sort of used to talking about in America, which is Ashkenazi Jewish immigration. Over time, Ashkenazi Jews were able to assimilate, although when they first arrived here, they were not necessarily considered Jewish. What that assimilation resulted in is Ashkenazi Jews being able to access the American dream, as we call it. That means no longer being subjected to structural targeting under the legal system or exclusion from most white spaces. This took time and most of it happened after World War II. It also means being able to exercise white privilege over other communities, including Black folks. And I'm gonna break down a little bit of how that has happened historically later in this talk. So a lot of times when we talk about Black-Jewish relationships, what we're really talking about are civil rights partnerships that go back over the past century. A really important moment in this history was the lynching of Leo Frank. Leo Frank was a Jewish man who was wrongfully accused of raping and killing a white Christian woman who was an employee at a factory where he was the foreman. He was taken out of prison and lynched and by KKK members. And this was a really unique example that sort of tied anti-Semitism into American lynch law, where if white people felt that Black people weren't being properly punished, or for really any reason at all, they could take your life. And this did happen to a Jewish man named Leo Frank. It led to the creation of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, and is a basis for a lot of Jewish sympathy towards Black people because this is a shared experience. In part because of this and for other reasons, a lot of Jewish philanthropists funded groups like the NAACP in the early days of the movement. And most famously, Jewish people participated as white allies to Black organizing, like in the 1964 Freedom Summer. And the image that you see on your screen right now shows the three very famous civil rights martyrs, two of whom were Jewish, who were killed that summer fighting for freedom. And this is a really important part of Jewish history and a really important part of Black history that we share together. Also very famous and iconic are the rabbis who joined in civil rights organizing, like Abraham Joshua Heschel and others who are now sort of seen as iconic and almost representing the Jewish community. I'm going to talk about a little bit about why that's something we need to complicate. So already we see that the relationships between Jews and whiteness and race in America were impacting these relationships with Jews and Black communities. There was a lot of issues where, Jewish activists joining the civil rights movement were using their white privilege and power to help Black people. This is something that Rita Schwerner, the widow of Michael Schwerner, one of the Mississippi martyrs, spoke about at his funeral. She's very clear that Michael's death was being paid attention to because he was a white man, and she wanted people to hear more or think more about the loss of James Chaney, the Black man who was killed in that incident. But the same white allyship also led to issues of paternalism and a lot of frustration from Black people who felt that white allies, including Jewish folks in the movement, were talking down to them or telling them how to organize in a way that was not appropriate. And the truth is the majority of the US Jewish community did not participate in civil rights organizing, and there was a lot of backlash against people who did. And going back to that previous point I was making, one of the people sort of called out in Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail are actually white Jewish allies who were holding back support from nonviolent resistance because they thought even that was too extreme. So we were part of the white people who were being called out even in that moment. As the civil rights movement developed into the Black Power movement, which we know came about more in the 70s, involved the Black Panther Party. This also led to a lot of solidarity with third world movements, including Palestine. This and the sort of Black Power focus of the movement at this time led to a lot of Jews leaving the movement and led to a lot of tensions that continued. And it's important to note that even as all this solidarity was happening, structural racism was always sort of in the room and impacting people's ability to connect to each other. A really important example of this is the New York City teacher strike. This was a conflict in Brooklyn's Ocean Hill-Brownsville neighborhood between the Black and Puerto Rican community and the majority white teachers union over what was a new experiment in giving communities control over local school districts. What happened was the new experimental community-controlled school board transferred 19 white teachers to other districts. They said that they were underperforming and failing to serve Black and brown students in these schools. The teachers union then went on a citywide strike, saying that this transfer violated their rights as workers. The strike lasted 36 days. It impacted the entire city. It was incredibly disruptive to education at the time. And during this conflict, what ended up happening is that folks from the teachers union, some Jewish organizations like the ADL, AJC, groups like this, circulated flyers that had been posted up in the neighborhood that were anti-Semitic, and sort of represented this as somehow speaking for the larger community. And there was a lot of protest line picketing and sort of trading of barbs between Black and Jewish communities during this time. And the conflict was portrayed as a Black versus Jewish issue in the media, which is something that many historians are now challenging, both because it erases Puerto Rican involvement and because this was really a struggle between a white-dominated teachers union and a Black community that was fighting for a form of self-determination over their education. And I know it's very instinctive to want to support, for me personally, to want to support a labor struggle. And I think it's important to note that this is an example of how sometimes these issues tend to come head to head, and sometimes even labor unions or other organizations that we want to support can act in ways that are also in the interests of structures of white supremacy. The impact of the 1968 teacher strike has been really interesting and sort of lasted to this day. It led to an end of the experimental community-controlled public schools. So that's a material difference for Black and brown people. It gave rise to a notion of Black anti-Semitism that we hear referred to a lot. And the assumption is that this form of anti-Semitism is somehow different or worse than anti-Semitism as it exists in the larger society. This is a problem, I think. It also empowered extremism in the Jewish community, which is something we don't really talk about. Meir Kahane, who founded the Jewish Defense League, which was later deemed a terrorist organization by the US and Israel, founded this organization to patrol what he called frontier neighborhoods between Black and Jewish communities. And Meir Kahane would eventually become a very famous demagogue, known for anti-Arab and anti-Soviet sort of positions, or also organizing in support of Soviet Jewry. But a lot of his early days were spent working on the sort of tensions between Black and Jewish people. And Meir Kahane and Louis Farrakhan, who was a leader of the Nation of Islam, a Black separatist organization, really benefited from each other and were able to sort of build their reputations off of their rivalry. And this was sort of the beginning of Meir Kahane's role in that way. And this also set the stage for later conflicts between Black and Jewish communities and how they're portrayed in the media. So it's a really important incident. It's not the only incident that can be used to understand this, but I think it's an important example for us to understand. So I want to break down white supremacy as it appears in Jewish communities and anti-Semitism as it appears in Black communities. Racism in the US Jewish community is usually an extension of white Jewish supremacy. We're not unique in having this in our community. Jewish spaces can be experienced as white space in a lot of cases, where if you are a non-white appearing person, you will be assumed to not belong there. This has led to certain incidents targeting Black and brown people. There was a really famous case of a Black bar mitzvah tutor who was targeted in the streets of Brooklyn for walking down the street with a Torah in his hand. He was surrounded by a mob of Jewish people who assumed he did not own that property or that he had stolen it. That's just one example. There are more than one, unfortunately. And like I was saying, Black and Jewish people can experience racism, profiling, and exclusion in our communities. And there's a lot of writing on this. I unfortunately don't have time to get into all of it, but it's important to note that the Black people in the Jewish community are sometimes the sort of first people to have to absorb the racism and unfairness that happens in our communities. This also can unfortunately manifest in anti-Black attitudes towards Black Lives Matter and other organizing. There was an incident pretty recently where Mort Klein, who is the head of the Zionist Organization of America, sent out some tweets declaring Black Lives Matter to be white-hating, Israel-hating, and violent. This is, of course, like stereotypical and not necessarily true or not true. And it's like one very clear example of how anti-Black attitudes can manifest in the Jewish community. It's also important to note that Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian attitudes can also inform anti-Blackness. The designation of Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization by some in the Jewish community is in part because Black Lives Matter has relationships with Palestinians. And these are historic relationships in the same way that Black and Jewish relationships are historical. And it's important not to simply dismiss that as support for terrorism. Also, Black Muslims are treated in ways that can be very stereotypical in our communities sometimes. Anti-Semitism in Black communities. Now, I really want to challenge this notion of Black anti-Semitism as being unique or different from other forms of anti-Semitism. While it has its own unique, certainly like manifestations, it's really rooted in the same issue, which is US Christian hegemony. A lot of the stereotypes that you will hear about Jewish people in the Black community are the same ones you will hear from white people. You'll hear things about how Jews control the banks and the media, Jews killed Jesus, Christians are the real Hebrews, and Jews are somehow usurping the covenant with God. This is rooted in Christian hegemony, and Black folks, while we're perfectly capable of participating in it, did not invent this. This is something that was learned during slavery. There are cases of this that have led to violence. There was the attack in Jersey City last year. That is one unfortunate example where a couple who had been influenced by Black Hebrew Israelite, which is a Black separatist religion, teachings about Jews, attacked a kosher shop in Jersey City. And that was like a really traumatic event for a lot of people in the community. These tensions can also be exacerbated by structural racism. A really good reference on this would be James Baldwin's essay, Negroes are anti-Semitic because they are anti-white. I wish I had time to go into that today, but I want to leave some time for questions later. But that's a really helpful resource on that. Black separatist groups like the Nation of Islam and the Black Hebrew Israelites have unfortunately played a role in helping to spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And a lot of the times these sort of tropes that are promoted by these groups can make it into Black culture more broadly because of a sort of cultural the relevance that these groups have is beyond just their membership. One unfortunate example of this is Louis Farrakhan's book, The Secret History of Blacks and Jews, which blames Jewish people for the transatlantic slave trade. I want to be really clear that while some Jewish people did participate in the transatlantic slave trade, the idea that they orchestrated this is totally false and anti-Semitic. And it actually really let white Christians off the hook for a system that they created by using a scapegoat that they also created. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the same way that white supremacy can be internalized in the Jewish community in terms of anti-Blackness, it can also be internalized in the Black community and expressed as anti-Semitism. While I don't think that all critique of Israel is anti-Semitic, obviously I just spent a lot of my time critiquing Israel and supporting Palestinians and their free speech rights to do so. There are times in the Black community where criticism of Israeli policy can be conflated with a critique of Jewish people as a whole. Farrakhan has been very adept at doing this and often frames these same things in a sort of Christian hegemonic framework, even as the Nation of Islam is sort of presenting itself as an alternative to this history. So yeah, we covered a lot just now. So I want to talk about how white nationalism continues to target both Black and Jewish people. The Tree of Life synagogue shooting and the Emmanuel AME church shooting were both cases where Jewish and Black communities were being targeted by white nationalists. Trump, a lot of the time, will use classic anti-Black and classic white anti-Semitic tropes to refer to both of our communities. Most recent being Trump's sort of constant comments about how Jewish people either should be loyal to Israel or are loyal to Israel, or the most recent comments that came out today where he sort of insinuated that Jewish people are only looking out for themselves. It was also revealed that he'd said that Black people are sort of at fault for the fact that we are still dealing with oppression in this country. The Charlottesville March was a pro-Confederate march in defense of Confederate statue. We have to remember this history, but they also chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And this again goes back to that trope of Jewish people and Black people somehow working together to undermine the white race. And there is a theory among white supremacists that Jews are in a conspiracy to bring in immigrants and to uplift communities of color in the US to replace white people. This is very contradictory, as we know, because Jewish people can also be white people, but we're not looking to these to white supremacists for parents. There's also Soros conspiracy theories, which blame Jews, like I said, for orchestrating Black resistance and non-white migration to the US. This was a key influence on the Tree of Life shooter. It's important to note Trump continues to spread similar conspiracy theories, but so unfortunately do some people in the Jewish right. We've heard Mort Klein reference them. We've heard Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, reference them. And this is specifically to undermine the left in Israel, which I think is important. He invoked Soros conspiracy theories when talking about how many Jews in Israel were opposing his policies, discriminating against and deporting African asylum seekers. So I want to talk about another issue that's come up recently, which is the Women's March. The Women's March began as protests against the inauguration of Donald Trump. It became a global movement, and it's really a form of coalitional organizing in which many different groups of people who've experienced marginalization are participating. The 2018 March saw a lot of controversy when the Women's March leader, Tamika Mallory, was revealed to have attended Louis Farrakhan's Savior's Day speech, in which he made some very virulent anti-Semitic comments. She was also on the record as supporting his organizing and praising his role in the Black community. What immediately happened was there was a rush to sort of frame this issue as a Black versus Jewish issue. And what that missed was there were a lot of Black Jewish organizers involved in Women's March, involved in organizations like Jews for Racial and Economic Justice in New York, who were like part of these movements who also felt hurt by this incident. And these Black Jewish organizers ended up being a big part of the solution, or one solution that happened in terms of the organizing. Due to basically efforts to educate Women's March leadership on anti-Semitism and the role of Jews in social movements. Tamika Mallory eventually went on The Breakfast Club, which is a very popular show in Black media, and she apologized and denounced anti-Semitism. What she did not denounce was Louis Farrakhan, and there are some complicated reasons for that. So basically Tamika Mallory had been supported by the women of the Nation of Islam after her partner was killed. And it was hard for her as an individual to denounce Farrakhan. And so for a lot of people in the Jewish community, they felt that the apology for not taking anti-Semitism seriously was not enough. And that kind of tended to be where a lot of people stopped paying attention to this issue, unfortunately. But what happened that got a lot less attention was that an organization called Jewish Women of Color Marching put a lot of effort into the 2019 Women's March. You can see an image on your screen right now of Shahana McKinney-Belden holding a Torah during that march to make Jewish issues and Jews of color front and center. And you can watch the videos from that day, they're quite inspiring, where anti-Semitism is really being named alongside racism as a form of white supremacy and something that needs to be fought. And while this wasn't really discussed a lot in the broader Jewish community, I remember I was at my synagogue the night before that march happened, and Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL was speaking, and he talked about the Women's March and didn't mention this at all. That was pretty frustrating for me. I really felt that aspect of it, the sort of organizing that happened in the aftermath, was a victory for Black and Jewish people, and that it brought a much deeper understanding of Jewish issues and anti-Semitism into this space. And Tamika Mallory's apology, whether you feel like it went far enough or not, actually did a lot to sort of speak to why Black and Jewish people need to be working together. That was a big part of her apology. And if you want, you can look up the video of this on YouTube. I think she does a good job of educating Black folks who might not be aware about the connections between these issues about why our communities need to fight with each other. The fallout from this controversy continues to impact the movement. And it was a big issue when the new leadership of the Women's March was announced last year. There was someone who had to step down, I believe, because of tweets that were labeled anti-Semitic, and it's caused a lot of tensions between folks in the pro-Palestinian and Muslim community who felt like they were being unfairly maligned because of this issue. I don't really have time to address all of that right now, but I just want to be clear that this is still an ongoing and very disputed incident. So finally, I want to talk about resisting together. I really do believe that Black and Jewish people have a shared interest in fighting white supremacy, understanding our shared history of being both oppressed under the system and the differences between how our communities have been treated is really important to understanding and helping to push forward that fight. I really think both communities need to better educate ourselves on each other. In the Black community, I do think that one thing I've unfortunately had to address, and I usually address this towards other Black folks, is a sort of cultural arrogance or feeling that we already know all there is to know about Jewish people based on them being white or based on what we know from Christianity. And that of course erases Jews of color and Black Jewish people. And it also can lead to a lot of the misunderstandings and incidents of anti-Semitism we've seen. Nick Cannon's comments on his podcast recently were a really high profile example of this. And that was an incident where he was basically just sort of repeating things that he had learned from basically Farrakhan and a Black rapper named Professor Griff, who used to be part of Public Enemy. But that incident really came from a place of ignorance. And one of the things that was able to sort of push Nick Cannon to be better on these issues was interacting with the Jewish community and being educated on why what he said was so problematic. And a lot of these incidents are rooted in this kind of ignorance. And I would say within the Jewish community, we also need to educate ourselves on both how we have, in a lot of cases, benefited from white supremacy, and also the ways that things that happen in Black movements that some Jewish people can perceive as hostile are not necessarily directed at them as Jewish people. For example, there's a lack of understanding about the history of Black and Palestinian relationships, where it's assumed that Black people are being pro-Palestinian simply because they hate Jews, when in fact, there's sort of decades of relationships and communication and cultural sharing that has informed these relationships in the same way that Black and Jewish people have, formed our relationships. Another thing that I think is really, really important is building community and relationships on a community level. A lot of the times when there's an incident of anti-Semitism in the Black community, what you tend to see is a big response from, sort of Jewish legacy institutions like the ADL, the AJC, sort of like pouncing on the issue and making sort of a public statement and demanding another public statement. In my experience, this is not the most helpful way to actually like get people to change on this issue. And before you can make a demand on another community, you have to sort of be in relationship. And I know that that's really difficult. And if the truth is, it can't actually start at these moments when something bad happens. We have to have already been in community to be able to leverage a relationship to get accountability. And so that's why I think it's really important in these places where Black and Jewish communities mix or touch each other. We have to be building relationships there, and we have to be doing this well before an incident of anti-Semitism happens. And similarly, there are many Jewish communities that are totally cut off and disengaged from Black folks, even the Black folks in their own community. And so it's really important before there's an incident of racism to start to develop the relationships. And you can, I think, in some cases come together after something bad has happened. In Jersey City, there was a lot of Black-Jewish solidarity following the attack there. And similar things happened in Brooklyn recently when there were anti-Semitic hate crimes. And also there was a lot of work to repair after high-profile incidents of Black people being targeted in majority white Jewish communities. But it really is best to start the building before this happens. Finally, I think it's really important to like center and listen to the voices of Black Jewish folks. We are the first people harmed when there is anti-Semitism in the Black community. We're the first people harmed when there's anti-Black racism in the Jewish community, simply because we're in those communities. And I think, unfortunately, as happened in the case of the Women's March, there's a tendency to sort of overlook the people at these intersections. Even myself, in the way I've been talking about these issues tonight, I had to sort of erase myself throughout all of this, because you kind of have to talk about Black and Jewish people as being these discrete communities in order to really make any sense in the sort of language that we're given right now. So I think it's really important to center and listen to the voices of Black Jewish folks. And like in the case of the Women's March, there is an ability to sort of cross boundaries and, push for education and atonement and a healing of our relationships from the people who are at those intersections. So it's really important to center those voices. All right, so that's my main presentation. I know I've covered a lot. Some of that was probably a little fast. So I want to give some time for a Q&A, and I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was extraordinarily thought-provoking and well articulated. We do have a number of questions that have emerged. Before I pose to you some of these questions, there's one initial question about whether or not a video of this presentation will be available afterwards. And the answer to that is yes, it will take some time, but just a shameless plug for the SWIG program at Jewish Studies and Social Justice. We have a YouTube channel that if you go to YouTube and search for the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at USF, you will be able to find it. If you subscribe to our channel, you'll get notifications every time we load a new video. And we post video of pretty much every single one of our public events. and this one is no exception. So if you were wondering, yes, there will be a video of this presentation available afterwards in the next couple of weeks on our YouTube channel. Okay, shameless plug finished. Back to much more important and timely topics. First is just a relatively simple one. Someone asked if you could explain BIPOC.
Yeah, I think I try to say it out loud, but sometimes I forget. It's Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And this is, yeah, it refers to sort of people racialized under white supremacy as non-white.
Awesome, thank you. Someone asks, how would you suggest white Jews adopt an anti-racist practice, whether with traditional Hebrew texts or other ones?
I mean, this is in some ways almost a question for a rabbi. I'm not an expert on like the spiritual end of how to fight anti-racism, but I think I'm involved in my synagogue right now in trying to address racism, and I think that there's a few things that are necessary. One thing that's important is like getting together and talking about the issues in the synagogue, listening to Jewish people of color, also making sure that any programming that results from from this attempt to address issues of racism not only addresses white people, but also makes space for the people of color in the community. I think one issue that I've seen is sometimes people are so focused on fighting their own white supremacy that they forget that there are people of color in the room who can't do that same work or actually need support with the racism they've been experiencing, rather than simply to like sit there while white people educate themselves. We know that there's a really rich history of like Jewish liturgy and Jewish religious thought around justice, and I think that that can really provide a backbone. And I'm also very interested in sort of programming that looks at like what these things have meant for Black folks in the Jewish community and non-Jewish Black folks as well. One of the things I grew up going to, which is almost a cliche at this point, was the Freedom Seders they have every year that celebrate both Passover and Black people's freedom in the U.S. And I think there are ways to keep developing that and to keep sort of pushing the bounds of culture or using culture to inform our anti-racist work. But I would go to like, there's actually a lot of Black Jewish rabbis who are doing work around this. Manish Chana is one Black Orthodox Jewish blogger who might be a potential resource on that.
Thank you very much. Another person says, first of all, great talk with an exclamation mark. Can you please talk more about the relationship between the Black community and pro-Palestinians? It would be helpful to understand this more.
Yeah, so the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s was plugged into something that's known as the Third World the Third World struggle movement, which involved a lot of different communities. And while that terminology may seem dated now, it was really important organizing in this era. And Palestinians were part of that. One of the connections that I personally sort of have had an opportunity to study is the way that Black and Palestinian prisoner movements informed each other. There was a Black Panther member named George Jackson who was incarcerated in California. And when he was killed during a prison uprising, his cell was raided and they found hundreds of books in it and a lot of handwritten notes. One of the handwritten notes was a poem that was attributed to George Jackson. It was later revealed that this was an English translation of a Palestinian poet describing his experiences in Israeli prison. And the experiences were so similar that it was completely mistaken for George Jackson's own description of his experience, to the point that this poem has been published under his name, in Black publications for a long time. And that's just one example of like how these movements supported each other. And there's now during Black Lives Matter organizing, especially during the Ferguson uprising, the solidarity of Palestinians was very important. I actually happened to be in the St. Louis area when this happened. I was there for a family reunion. And one of the things I remember was that my Black family members, who are not all very political, some of them are, some of them aren't, were talking about Gaza, because that was the year that there was an Israeli invasion of Gaza that was happening at the same time. And what ended up happening is that Black folks in Ferguson started chanting Gaza Strip at the police as they were being attacked, as they were being tear gassed, because they saw a relationship between the militarized police force responding to them and the occupation in Palestine. Later, Palestinians on social media started tweeting out advice for dealing with tear gas. So you had material support from Palestinians for Black folks on the ground that was a sort of representation of really decades of relationships. This caused a lot of consternation in the Jewish community, including the local St. Louis Jewish community, because people didn't really understand where this was coming from. They thought that Black people were sort of being manipulated into being pro-Palestinian, and they sort of missed that these relationships come about organically and are based on, you know, connections between our movements going back to that Black power era.
Thank you for that. I remember also, and I shared a picture in one of my classes, that that people in Ferguson were also holding up signs, not just chanting, but also holding up signs, making that connection. And then people in Gaza were doing the same about Ferguson. So it wasn't in the chants only, but also in the written words and the symbols that they were both bringing to these protests in that year. So thank you for responding to that one. Someone wants to know how, well, as we begin to mobilize our Jewish communities and partner with Black community organizations, what do you think might be the most effective targets in our campaigns that would have real results to help protect us all?
I mean, I think, you know, we're in a moment where confronting the sort of fascist takeover of this country is really important for both our communities. Confronting white nationalism, confronting Trump, I think is a very clear target. I think it's also important to look at in our local communities and see like what are the issues that Black folks are organizing around and supporting them. Right now, we know the verdict came down on a grand jury convening around Breonna Taylor's case, and there's going to be a lot of protests about the fact that no charges were actually levied in response to her killing. They were only levied in response to bullets that were fired into her neighbors' apartments. This is going to be like a really clear place where Black people and Jewish folks can sort of take on the, you know, the system of white supremacy as it's affecting Black folks. But there are lots of ways that they're affecting both of us. And I think, you know, the Trump administration's embrace of white nationalism is a really clear place where both of our lives are under threat from white supremacy.
I think based on that, or jumping off of that, there's another question about how can we make people know that part of the right-wing agenda is to maintain and sow further conflict between Black and Jewish communities?
I think that, you know, that's a really good question, and almost makes me wish I had spent some more time addressing that. But it's definitely true, and I think that unfortunately, in some cases, right-wing forces in the Jewish community are part of this, Black folks and Jewish folks, while we have plenty of differences and struggle between each other, have a very powerful history of co-resistance. And so pointing to that when it's when people try to present our interests as being opposed to each other is one way to sort of respond to that. I also think, you know, this is something that we can address as it comes up. Like in your community, if you're organizing with Black folks and you see that sort of pitting against each other, we can like look to the ways that historically our communities have been pitted against each other in service of white supremacy. I think the teacher strike is like one example of that. And say, we don't want to do that right now. We can deal with whatever internal conflicts come up on our own terms, in terms of our relationships with each other. And we don't have to accept this idea that our interests are inherently opposed.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. There's sort of a similar question, but coming from the opposite side, which is that to what extent do parts of the Jewish and Black communities have opposing interests in the current context? What are some of those opposing interests?
And yeah, I want to be very clear because we're talking about segments, and that's how the question frames things. It's not the wholesale issues. I think there are some cases, for example, where synagogues have employed police to protect them against white nationalist shooters, which on one hand is an incredibly reasonable response to a very real threat of violence. On the other hand, increased police presence in this area makes it less safe for Black and brown folks. That's like one area where we have to do some work to figure out how to both protect people and in the Jewish community and also protect people who are harmed by what might be the natural first response of people seeking help, which is to call the police. I think that there's also, there's a ton of issues. There are, Jewish people who are, as part of being part of like structural white supremacy in this country, who are maybe invested in things like the prison system, or are supporting companies that are, And so I think looking at that as one place. A really hot button issue that I don't really have time to get into right now is police exchanges, which there are campaigns by both actually Black and Jewish organizations around the issue of police exchanges between the US and Israel. In some cases, there's sort of an overblown attempt to portray this as like creating more police violence. I don't think that that's the case, but we know that they exist and we know that they're trading tactics, and this goes both ways. So war on terror sort of tactics from Israel are being imported to the US, and the US is also exporting war on drugs tactics to Israel that are targeting Palestinians and also Black and brown Jewish people there. And so I think that's one place where certain segments of the Jewish community are very invested in this. Some of our organizations are running these campaigns and these programs, and other people are protesting them. And there's a lot of debate about whether we can even talk about this issue. There are some people who think even mentioning it is anti-Semitic. But I think for Black folks, there's a really serious question of why this is happening. And if people don't think it's a harmful thing, what do they think it's doing that's positive when we're really demanding things like defunding the police in this country?
Thank you. There's a question from someone who is a Jewish studies professor at a Bay Area institution who identifies as an Ashkenazi Jew, who writes that a number of times in my career, I have bumped up against some of the tensions you discussed tonight. More specifically, I've had many discussions with faculty of color who seem unwilling to allow space for Jewish studies to exist well beyond what they consider to be a form of quote unquote white studies. How might you suggest having a discussion with someone who doesn't see Jews of color, or the countless ways that Jewish studies is different from so-called white studies?
This is a really interesting question. I would have a question back to this person, but we probably don't have time for that, which is like, what is the space that's sort of being asked? Because I think my response to the question would kind of vary about that. But what I will address is the sort of labeling of Jewish studies as a white studies. The reason Jewish studies needs to exist, or one of the reasons, is because of Christian hegemony. We are living in a society that privileges Christianness and assumptions about, a Christian worldview onto everything we see. That's being projected all the time. So you need studies of Jewish people and Jewish history to actually address that, and to address white supremacy. You need to also address anti-Semitism. That's something I would say. One of the things I didn't get into that I explain in my other talks about anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism is actually foundational to white Christian hegemony. It was sort of a colonial view of people that existed before colonialism extended beyond Europe. The oppression of Jewish people for not being Christian deeply informed, the Spanish Inquisition. It informed Protestant views of colonialism. And I think that sort of framing anti-Semitism as foundational to white supremacy and colonialism can sort of help break down the idea that this is just white studies. Also, the fact that, while the US may be the US Jewish community may be majority white, it is not solely white. And the world is full of Jewish people of many different ethnicities. So, in a non-tokenizing way, discussing the fact that like Ethiopian Jewish people exist, Jewish people from Southwest Asia, North Africa exist, Jewish people exist all across the continent of Africa, in China, in India, in Afghanistan, around the world, I think is another way to sort of combat that idea that Jewish studies is white studies. And also addressing the extent to which some Jewish studies programs don't include these communities enough can kind of help to address that as well, because it's a lot harder to accuse you of Jewish doing white studies if you're studying people who aren't just white Ashkenazi Jews.
There's a follow-up about this, which is regarding sort of the place of Jewish studies in ethnic studies. The question is twofold. One, is there a place for Jewish studies within the framework of ethnic studies. And someone asked, can you please speak to the current issue with the ethnic studies curriculum and anti-Semitism?
Okay. I don't feel like fully able to speak to the ethnic studies curriculum because there are other people who are Jewish people who are organizing around this, who I would point to. I did moderate a webinar. I don't have the link, but I'll send it to you, that where other people were discussing this. I think they're the experts and I would defer to them. There's been a lot of writing about this and a lot of debate about this in the Jewish community. My feeling is that I think that there can be a role for some Jewish studies and ethnic studies, but the idea that Jewish studies is inherently ethnic studies rubs up into a couple issues because Jewish studies actually, I think, has a broader lens than ethnic studies does. Ethnic studies was sort of created to respond to like deficits around education and like the colonial education on issues affecting Black people and people in third world movements. I think there is a role of Jewish studies in this, but the idea that Jewish studies, which has like a lot of study of white people, it's part of it, right? And studies of religion, studies of, you know, history that really predates these notions of race, it makes it a sort of almost a bigger sort of umbrella for things, some of which would fit under ethnic studies and some things are sort of outside the scope of ethnic studies. And I would, again, defer to the people who have spent a lot of time writing and organizing around this, who are better able to speak to that than me.
Thank you for taking that on. Certainly, it's a very challenging issue. Someone asks, you belong to identities that have backgrounds of extreme oppression. When it comes to overcoming systemic oppression, do you feel like violence is ever justified? Or do you strictly condone education and allyship and other forms of...
Well, let's look at Jewish history for a second. Have we only resisted nonviolently? Look at, you know, I think I'm very proud of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I'm very proud of Jewish resistance that involved fighting back against Nazis. Personally, in a philosophical sort of point of view, I think violence should actually be avoided because it's like corrosive internally, but I also understand why it can't always be avoided. I think, but up until the point where it's literal self-defense, I think we should be finding other ways simply because it's better for us not to engage in violence. And I've seen the way that unfortunately, like, violence gets internalized in communities that have been experiencing it. But we have to be clear that, like, when people are being faced with violence, are you going to tell someone, you know, for example, in a concentration camp that they can't fight back? I don't think so. So it's not something I think I would ever glorify. You know, also having witnessed violence in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's really ugly. It's really horrific what this does to people. And I think, you know, I don't romanticize it at all, but I'm very careful about moralizing to people who are in conditions that make it impossible for them to live.
Thank you. That's an important conversation that I have with my students in class every semester. And so we appreciate hearing from you and your response on that. Since you just mentioned Israel-Palestine, there's a few more questions about what you're talking about within the Israel-Palestine context. So let's return to some of these. Someone asks if you would address the issue of the quote unquote progressive accept Palestine stance of many mainstream Jewish institutions that talk about support for Black liberation while condemning anyone who supports Palestinian liberation. What might we do to expose the fallacy of this thinking? Because as we know, liberation is not divisible.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something, you know, for me, I'm coming from a position of someone who does what is referred to as pro-Palestinian organizing, or has in the past. And I think that this can be a sort of a blind spot that people miss, that many of the conditions that we rightfully speak out against that our Black people are experiencing are also being experienced by Palestinians. And not only Palestinians, but, you know, non-Jewish Afghan asylum seekers, Mizrahi and Ethiopian communities in Israel. And if you care about Israel, I think you should care about the people who live in Israel and not just sort of view them from the point of view of the state or, you know, the interests of the government, but also like, what are people actually experiencing? And that means looking at how Palestinian citizens of Israel have been, you know, internally displaced, experience widespread discrimination. It means looking at the occupation. It means looking at Gaza. It means looking at the refugee diaspora and what has happened to those people. And I understand that this is really difficult and it involves confronting some of our own trauma. But I think it's better for everyone if we can start to think critically and act on this. And I understand where the impulse comes from. It's a very complicating thing when you've had a relationship with Israel your whole life to hear these things that are critical, that challenge that idea of Israel, that challenge that dream. But it's necessary in the same ways that the American dream also needs to be challenged because it is not available to everyone.
Jumping off of that, a follow-up question is, how does one have a productive and compassionate dialogue about Israel-Palestine that doesn't devolve into finger-pointing at best, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism at worst?
Well, that's a tricky, I think we're all sort of striving to that. One of the things that has helped me is grounding, for me personally, I don't think it's enough for me to just be in solidarity with Palestinians. I have to understand what's happening within Israeli society. And that has helped me sort of respond to people more compassionately because you understand that they're coming from not just a place of this conflict, but a place of, internal politics, internal repression. That for me was really helpful, was looking beyond the binary of it. I've done a lot of work in dialogue groups that I got criticism for from pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel people, but that for me really helped, just being in a space where people are sharing their experiences and you don't react with judgment, you just listen. That's really important practice. I think learning how to listen first and then speak is just a key for life in general. And to not take, personally, I've experienced anti-Semitism in these movements. I try to, when it needs to be responded to, I'm very clear about having boundaries and responding to it. But when it's really clear that it's based in someone else's trauma, I try to move to where I need to be without internalizing that response, because I understand sometimes the responses or the language that you hear that you don't like, it's not always about you personally, it's sort of about other issues and other things that people are dealing with. And that doesn't mean it's not important or that it doesn't need to be addressed, but we can also think critically about how we respond. And when someone's acting from a place of pain, making sure we're not also acting from that same place of pain has helped me a lot.
Thank you. I think that's really, really helpful to hear. Let's move away from Israel-Palestine.
Okay.
And back into the US context and white supremacy here in the United States, how it's affecting you and Black and Jewish communities here in the US. Someone wants to know if you have any resentment towards white people, and what can white people do to be better at creating a space for Jewish and Black communities?
I mean, overall, I know that white people are people just like anyone else. I don't hold white supremacy against every single white person. There are moments when I do feel resentful of the sort of burden I have to carry. There are times when I'm with really well-meaning people who maybe even love me and support me, who unfortunately can inflict harm, and can definitely lead to feelings of resentment. Sorry, I just want to look at the question again real quick.
I think I dismissed it already. Sorry. Or not. Answered. Scroll all the way down to the bottom.
Okay, answered. Sorry. 1 second.
Or maybe not at the bottom. Sorry, everybody.
What was the second part of that? Sorry.
We can see the questions. You can't. I think it was something about what we can do to create space for Black and Jewish communities.
Yeah, so I think just remembering when we talk about Jews that includes Black people is really important. And I think just doing that internal work to be aware of how you can operate as a white person, if you're a white person speaking, in the ways that like privilege and power can come to you that you might not always pick up on or always remember are important. And I think the same sort of thing of like when someone reacts to you in anger, knowing that that's coming from a place of deep hurt that really predates your interaction is important. And I think just like continuing to study and build relationships will sort of like lead the ways into how you can make that space in your own community and in your own spaces.
So maybe you can see, all of you can see the questions, which is fantastic. Makes it a little bit easier. There's a question about Farrakhan.
Mm-hmm.
Someone wants to know your take on Farrakhan and on the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives. How do you justify his support for the movement for Black lives?
Well, I don't justify anything Farrakhan does because I really dislike him. To be clear, I'm living in the Black community. I've known about Farrakhan probably longer than a lot of y'all have because he's in the Black community. He's not only anti-Semitic, he's anti-queer, he's anti-feminist. He opposes women's rights to abortion. He opposes interfaith and interracial relationships. He's also, actually, his politics are quite right-wing. There's a really good essay on this. I think it's called Black Fundamentalism that sort of outlines the way that he's actually very pro-capitalist, very, very right-wing and like regressive in a lot of his social views. I don't, and the thing is, Black Lives Matter is a movement that was started by Black queer women. Let's be really clear. So like there's actually a fundamental disagreement between Farrakhan and BLM. A lot of these same women are organizing against abuse within the Black community, which Farrakhan defends all the time. He's defended Michael Jackson. He's defended R. Kelly and other abusers. So I think the idea that these are all unified just because they're Black is actually a really big problem and sort of a stereotype. And Farrakhan's beliefs are fundamentally opposed to like a lot of the goals and beliefs of the people organizing for Black Lives Matter. And I've written a lot about this actually. And it's just that there's a constant issue of assuming that because he's Black, he's somehow left-wing. That's just not true. That's what I would say to that.
While we're on the movement for Black lives, do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement partially erases the identity or identities of Black Jewish people by potentially not focus on and acknowledging their Jewishness?
I think it can happen. I wouldn't say the movement as a whole is guilty of that because it's not focused on the religion of a particular group of Black people. There are cases like it, you know, yeah, I just don't really think that that's something you can, you know, it's like a decentralized movement. There are, of course, places where Jews of color get erased or Black Jews get erased because we just generally get erased. But the idea that Black Lives Matter is specifically doing this, I haven't really seen. And if anything, like, there are places where Black Jewish women have been leaders in this movement, along with Black Muslim women and Black Christian women. Yeah.
Is it productive for people with privilege to challenge exclusive systems from within, or are they further enabling those systems?
This is an interesting question. I mean, it's kind of, I have a good friend of mine who tried this first in the IDF. He thought he was going to be a good soldier who helped protect Palestinian rights and found that that was impossible and he was actually punished for it. He later went on to be a prosecutor in the Bay Area, hoping to challenge that system from within, and found that it was ultimately impossible. I think that is really hard to do that. There are, of course, people who have done this successfully. There's, you know, people from the inside who have given information to movements that have been helpful. There is like a history of like secret collaboration in a lot of spaces, but that's really difficult, and it does run that risk of just buying yourself further into the system. I think Leonard Cohen has a line about this, you know, is sentenced to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. People have been trying it for a long time. You know, if you think you can do better, maybe you can, but I think a lot of people have found that that was a difficult thing. But at the same time, there are concrete ways to use your privilege to help people. And I think rather than trying to divest ourselves completely of that or ignore it, it's important to look for those ways and think, what power do I actually have given who I am and the spaces I'm in, and how can I support people?
There is a question here. How do I get my Trump-supporting Jewish family members to see the hypocrisy of their ways in a way they can internalize? I'm assuming the hypocrisy here is about what you're talking about with regards to Trump supporting white supremacy that targets Jews.
I really wish I had an easy answer for that. I don't. You know, a lot of my work is more trying to get people who are not quite in the Trump supporter area to be better and less about addressing Trump supporters. I think it's important work, you know, bless you for doing it. And I think it also really depends on why they're supporting Trump. You know, there are ways to sort of break down the mythology he's created around himself and also just really clear incidents of anti-Semitism. But if it's for, concerns about Israel, that will be like a really different response that you'll have to give versus if it's about just really liking like his rallies, But I think that there are good resources on sort of de-radicalizing your Trump supporting relatives that are more broad-based than just in the Jewish community, and I would sort of look to that.
Great. Someone wants you to know that they're very grateful for you quoting Leonard Cohen. I think that is very important. I often refer to him in my classes as Rabbi Leonard Cohen. As a senior, I grew up in a time when both in music and in art in New York City, there are many wonderful collaborations between Black and Jewish artists, particularly in the jazz world and in the poetry community. Are there similar overlappings today?
Well, one thing I always love to plug is my fellow Black Jews who are doing cool things. A good friend of mine, Anthony Russell, is singing Yiddish music that's also influenced or like based in like Black historical music. That is very cool. There's a singer who's not Jewish, Rhiannon Giddens, who has done a lot of work to sort of bring back the Black roots of Americana music. She has some really interesting talks about the connections between Black and Jewish music. And I really love this historic part of Black-Jewish relationships. I wish I had time to talk about it more. But we sort of together invented American culture in many, many ways, whether you're talking about jazz, whether you're talking about show tunes, whether you're talking about comedy. There's a lot of rich history there, and that is, of course, ongoing.
In the interest of your loving to plug your wonderful friends, there are a number of questions about books, movies, and groups. So let me start with this. Someone asked, are there any organizations of Black Jews or Jews of color that you would suggest white Jews might contact as part of a synagogue or some other group's efforts to investigate racial issues within their ranks?
So the Coalition is, I think, based in the Bay Area. They have a lot of really helpful stuff. There was a letter, if you're looking at making your organization more anti-racist, there was a letter called Not Free to Desist that I actually covered for Jewish Currents that looks at structural ways to make your Jewish institution anti-racist. I would look to them. Jews for Racial and Economic Justice in New York is doing a lot of amazing organizing. And a lot of Jewish organizations now have like Jews of color or Sephardi Mizrahi groups within them. So I think it's also good to ask if there's already organizing, happening in the local community around that.
All right. What about any documentary recommendations on Black and Jewish relations?
I would have to do some research. I think it's discussed a little bit in the Eyes on the Prize series, although I would have to re-examine that. I wish I had a better answer to that. I feel like as a documentary filmmaker, I should. I've done some work on Jews of color in Israel, but that's obviously a different thing than what we're talking about here. I could speak more to books, I think, actually.
That's the next question.
Yeah, so one of the books that I read when I was researching, for example, the teacher strike, I have it over here. It's called Black Antisemitism and Jewish Racism. This is a collection of essays that some of which are like I really disagree with and some of which I think are great that you can find about this issue. Oh my God, I have to like look over at my bookshelf. That's one that I've been reading. If you're interested in like part of the history of Jewish whiteness, how Jews became white folks is like one resource on this. For anti-Semitism, which also includes some analysis around Jews of color, there's a PDF, The Past Didn't Go Anywhere, that you can download for free that talks a little bit about how to address anti-Semitism in movements. And there's a lot of shorter articles. If you're looking for like Mizrahi Jewish history, Ella Shohat has books and a lot of really brilliant scholarship. And there is like an increasing amount of stuff out there. And maybe I can come, when I'm not thinking off the top of my head, I can come up with a better list to give to Oren after this. But those are just some of the things.
For those of you who are USF students, I would, again, this is a horribly shameless plug, to say that a lot of these texts and many others we read in the Jewish Studies and Social Justice program courses. So I urge you to register for a course I urge you to get in contact with me, and I am happy to provide you with a lengthy resource of some of these types of books and articles and films. And if this is a conversation that is of any interest to you, I highly encourage you to become a Jewish Studies and Social Justice minor at USF, because this is quite literally what we do in our program. Is we ensure that when we are talking about Jewish communities, we are not talking about Jewish communities as homogenous, but we are teaching about, and our faculty is researching about, the very broad, diverse, historical and contemporary mosaic of Jews, of Judaisms, of Jewish identities. So I guess I have no shame, and I should just say, contact me, become a Jewish Studies and Social Justice minor, take our courses.
If I was still in undergrad, I would be doing that. Like, it sounds really cool.
Happy to hear that. Maybe we will take just a couple of more questions. Along this line, there's a question that's similar, but I think different, maybe. If you have any favorite texts by Jews of color about their own intersectional identities.
So one of the things I read when I was young that was really informative for me was Rebecca Walker's book, Black, White, and Jewish. That was really helpful. There's a lot of writing in Jewish publications that's like short form writing. I would look to, there were previously, not so much now, a lot of Black folks writing for the forward that you can listen to. And I think Jewish Currents has some, a lot of, also Hey Alma has been doing a really good job with that. So there, if you even look like for tags around Black Jewish issues on these websites, you will find a lot of stuff from a lot of different voices. And it's shorter, it's not having to read a whole book.
Excellent. I actually realized one more shameless plug while we're at it. There is this really remarkable book by the founding director of the Jewish Studies and Social Justice program at the University of San Francisco, Professor Aaron Hunt Tapper. It's called Judaisms, a 21st Century Introduction to Jews and Jewish Identities. It happens to be sitting right next to me because I teach this book in class. And this is a great primer. That book is a great primer for all of these issues. I don't get any commission for saying that, but I do think that it's a great place to start as well. Someone's asking if you have any advice for biracial Jews.
Advice, okay. I mean, this will be a whole other talk, but I would say one of the most important lessons I learned was to stop feeling like I have to explain myself all the time. That is a really big burden that's put on ourselves, and after a certain point, just saying I'm a Black Jew and you can deal with that is enough, and we don't have to. I think also the most important community I have is other people who share this experience, and to really rely on that when you're struggling, I think is important, and to plug into those communities, and it's not always easy. And also just to be proud, because I think it can be really hard, and there's a lot of burden to carry being between two communities that have suffered so much and still fight. But for me, learning to find the places where my identity is actually like sort of a perfect harmony has really helped center me. And yeah, that's sort of my advice. Those are things I've learned along this journey.
I appreciate your sharing all of this with us. We are just about out of time, and I wonder if you want to make any shameless plugs yourself, because you're doing all kinds of remarkable work that this talk has clearly inspired people to want to explore more. If you want to share anything about your own films, writing, podcast, anything.
So I have a website. It's RebeccaPierceFilms.com. I'm in the process of updating it. So if you check that out like this week, I'll have a bunch of new information, including about podcasts I'm starting that will cover Jewish issues alongside a lot of other things. I have a Patreon, which was sort of inactive for a long time, but I'm bringing that back. So if this is something you want to support and you want early access to some of my filmmaking work, just look me up, Rebecca Pierce, on Patreon. I think it's also Rebecca Pierce Films. I'm on all the social medias, so feel free to, look me up. If there was a question that didn't get answered, feel free to like shout me on Twitter. Maybe I'll see it, or I might ignore it, but I'll try. And yeah, so that's my website is Rebecca Pierce Films, and my podcast will be called the Disperse Podcast, and it's part of a production company I'm starting with a close friend of mine. But you can find that information on my website starting probably like tomorrow.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much on behalf of all of my colleagues and students and friends and everyone who joined this webinar today. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. We learned a lot. We are really thrilled to be able to learn with and from you today. And best of luck to you in all of your work. And again, thank you very much. And thank you all for attending.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.